The coffin ship. It began with a box. In the spring of 1849, in the heart of Richmond, Virginia, a man stood inside a warehouse staring at an empty wooden crate. To the men working nearby, it was nothing unusual. Boxes came and went every day, filled with tobacco or cotton. But this box, measuring 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and just over 2 feet deep, was meant for something far more precious than cargo. It was meant to carry a man. His name was Henry Brown, but history would later remember him by another name, Henry Box Brown. He was born into slavery on a tobacco plantation in Louisa County. Like thousands of others, his life was measured in labor, his body owned, his fate sealed by the will of others. But there was something in Henry that refused to be broken. He could endure the pain, the heat, the endless work, but not the silence. Not the idea that his soul could be trapped forever in chains. Then came the day that tore his world apart. His wife Nancy and their 3 children were sold to another owner. Henry had saved money, begged, even prayed to stop it, but in the end, his family was dragged away, bound for the deep south. He would never see them again. That was the day something in Henry changed. Grief hardened into resolve. He began to plan the unthinkable. Weeks turned into months as he searched for a way out. He knew escape meant death if caught. Dogs, patrols, and bounty hunters roamed the borders, but Henry didn't want to run. He wanted to vanish, to disappear without leaving a trace. Then one day he met a man named Samuel Smith, a white storekeeper with a reputation for smuggling and risk. Henry proposed something Smith had never heard before. He would ship himself, literally, as freight. A box marked this side up with care. At first, Smith laughed. The idea was madness, but Henry wasn't joking. He had already measured his body, studied shipping routes, and chosen his destination, Philadelphia, where slavery was illegal. He would mail himself to freedom. The plan took days to prepare. A carpenter built the box with small air holes and a simple latch. Inside, Henry packed a small water flask, a few biscuits, and sheer determination. He paid Smith $166, every coin he had, to arrange the transport through the Adams Express Company, a freight service that shipped packages across the East Coast. On March 23, 1849, Henry climbed inside the box. The lid was nailed shut. Outside, the label read, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia. This side up with care." What followed was 27 hours of hell. The box was handled roughly from the start. It was dropped from a wagon, flipped upside down, stacked under heavier cargo. Henry felt the air thinning as the nails pressed into his back. Sweat dripped down his face, but he dared not move. He could hear the voices of workers outside, laughing, cursing, unaware that a living man was inside. Hours passed. Then came a moment when the box was turned on its head for what felt like eternity. Henry's veins pulsed. His head throbbed. His eyes rolled back. He nearly blacked out. In that darkness, he thought of his wife's face, of his children's laughter fading into silence. He whispered a prayer, the only sound in that coffin of wood and fear. When the train stopped at one point, he felt a chill wind through the air holes, a brief mercy. He heard the rhythmic clatter of wheels, the creak of wood, and imagined himself already dead, carried like a corpse to a grave no one would mark. Yet beneath the fear was something else. Hope, a quiet, steady hope that refused to die. By dawn the next day, the crate arrived at the Philadelphia office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Workers there were told to expect a package from Richmond. They carried it carefully into a meeting room. No one knew what was inside. When they pried open the lid, a voice came from within. "Gentlemen," it said, trembling but alive, "how do you do?" The men stepped back in disbelief. Slowly, Henry Brown lifted himself out of the box, his limbs stiff, his face drenched in sweat, his clothes soaked. Then, standing upright for the first time in more than a day, he looked around and smiled. He was free. It was an image that would burn itself into the conscience of America. A man who mailed himself out of slavery, defying a system built on human suffering. But freedom was only the beginning. Henry had escaped the South, but the shadows of slavery still followed him. What he didn't know then was that his story would soon make him famous and hunted. That box, his coffin and his salvation, would turn him into a symbol, and symbols, in a divided America, were dangerous. When Henry Brown stepped out of that wooden box in Philadelphia, the men in the room froze. They had seen scars. They had heard the cries of those who escaped through swamps and night roads, but they had never witnessed anything like this. A man resurrected from a box that could have been his coffin. They gave him water. They gave him air. But more than that, they gave him silence, because no one could find words big enough to fill that moment. Henry stood tall, trembling but alive. For the first time in his life, no one owned him. He was not a name on a ledger, not a body in the fields. He was a man. He bowed his head, whispered a prayer, and wept. Soon word spread through the city. Abolitionists gathered to see him, to hear his story. The newspapers called him the man who came out of a box. Within days, Henry Box Brown became a living legend. Churches invited him to speak. Activists urged him to tell his story to the nation. His voice became a weapon against the darkness of slavery, but freedom, he learned, carried its own dangers. At first, his story inspired awe. Crowds filled halls to see him reenact his escape. He would step into a replica of the box, close the lid, then rise again before cheering audiences. Each performance was a reminder of his suffering and survival. Yet behind the applause, there were whispers. Some said he was turning pain into spectacle. Others accused him of exploiting his own trauma. Henry didn't care. He needed to survive. He had lost everything: his family, his past, his home. Now, his story was all he had left. By the summer of 1849, his escape had reached every corner of the country. But fame carried risk. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was approaching, a law that would make it legal for slave catchers to seize escaped slaves even in free states. If caught, Henry could be sent back to Virginia, back to chains. He started moving under false names. Friends in the abolitionist movement warned him to stay hidden, but Henry refused to live in fear. Instead, he traveled north, performing and speaking in towns across New England. His story was too powerful to bury. One evening, in Boston, he stood before a packed church. The lights flickered from oil lamps, casting long shadows on the walls. Henry spoke softly, his voice trembling with memory. "I was dead," he said, "and in that box I was reborn." The crowd was silent. Some wept, others clenched their fists. A single man's suffering had exposed the cruelty of a nation. But even as he rose in fame, his heart remained heavy. Each night, when the crowds dispersed and the applause faded, he thought of Nancy and the children. Were they still alive? Did they know he had made it? Freedom without them felt hollow, like air without breath. Then came the threat he feared most. Reports reached him that slave hunters from Virginia had been seen in Philadelphia, asking questions about a man in a box. They had descriptions, they had witnesses. The law, now on their side, could drag Henry back to the very world he had escaped. A friend in the movement whispered one word to him: leave. And so, Henry made a choice few could understand. He boarded a ship bound for Liverpool, England, the land that had abolished slavery years before. It was safer there. But as the shoreline of America faded, Henry's victory felt uncertain. He had escaped death once, but exile was another kind of prison. In London, he was received as a hero. Crowds gathered to hear him recount his daring escape. The British press called him the man who mailed himself to liberty. He published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Henry Box Brown, in 1851. It sold thousands of copies. He performed across England and Scotland, using art and illusion to tell his story. Over time, he transformed from fugitive to performer, from survivor to showman. His exhibitions blended history and theater. He would climb into a replica box, then emerge again before the audience, a living symbol of hope. But as the years passed, something inside him shifted. The applause grew louder, yet his own voice felt distant. He had escaped one box only, to build another, a box of fame, expectation, and memory. Every time he reenacted his suffering, the pain returned like a ghost. Still, he performed, because that was how he stayed alive. How he reminded the world that freedom was not free. By the late 1850s, Henry was no longer just a man who escaped slavery. He had become a myth, a figure caught between legend and loneliness. His story was taught in churches, whispered in taverns, printed in pamphlets. Yet behind the myth stood a man still haunted by the faces of those left behind. As one British journalist wrote in 1852, he escaped the box, but the box has never truly left him. In the next part, we follow Henry's years in exile, how he built a new life in a foreign land, and how the ghosts of his past refused to die. In England, Henry Box Brown found something he had never known in America: safety. No slave catchers, no chains, no fear of the law. The streets of London were crowded with carriages, coal, smoke, and freedom. Yet as he walked those streets, he carried something heavier than iron: memory. He spoke in churches, theaters, and lecture halls. The crowds came by the hundreds. They wanted to see the man who had defied death. They wanted to touch a piece of history. Henry gave them what they wanted, but each word, each performance, reopened an old wound. He stood under the glow of gas lamps, the replica box beside him. When the curtain rose, silence fell. Henry would kneel, fold himself into the wooden crate, and close the lid. For a moment the audience would see nothing, only the sound of nails and the echo of his breathing. Then, after a pause, the lid would open, and Henry would rise. The crowd erupted every time. To them, it was courage. To Henry, it was haunting. He once told a friend, "Every time I climb back into that box, I remember how close I came to dying." The money helped. His shows sold out across Britain. He performed not just his escape, but other scenes, biblical reenactments, dramatic readings, even early forms of magic and illusion. Over time, he became known as both an abolitionist and an entertainer. But his mission was never just to entertain. He wanted people to see the cost of human freedom, to feel it in their bones. Still, the fame was fragile. Britain was changing. The public grew hungry for spectacle, not sermons. Some called him a hero. Others called him a fraud who turned tragedy into theater. He ignored them. He had endured worse. By 1855, Henry's life had taken a quieter turn. He met an Englishwoman, Jane Floyd, a talented singer. They married and had a daughter. For the first time since losing his first family, Henry felt a measure of peace. He bought a small house in the countryside and continued performing, now as Professor H. Box Brown, touring with his wife as part of a traveling show that blended storytelling, illusion, and music. But even in comfort, the past was never far. At night, he dreamed of Richmond, of Nancy's face, of the sound of the nails sealing the box. Sometimes, he would wake up gasping, clutching his chest, feeling again the weight of wood pressing against him. He never spoke of these dreams, not even to Jane. The world around him moved on. America was tearing itself apart. The Civil War began in 1861, and for the first time, the abolition he had preached was becoming real through blood and fire. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, Henry wept. He had lived long enough to see the world he dreamed of, but joy soon gave way to something else: emptiness. He had waited so long for this day, yet now he felt like an outsider to his own victory. In a letter written that same year, Henry confessed, "I am free, yet my heart still beats inside the box." By the late 1860s, he decided to return to America. The war was over. The country was changed. But was there a place for him in it? He sailed back quietly, no longer the celebrity he had been. When he landed in Boston, few recognized him. The crowds had found new heroes. New names filled the newspapers. Henry's story had become part of history, remembered, but distant. Still, he found work performing small shows in northern cities, telling the same story that had once shocked the world. He brought his wife and daughter, forming a small family troupe. Together they traveled from town to town, keeping the story alive. Audiences still came. Some were curious, others came out of respect, but Henry had changed. His performances were slower now, softer, tinged with sadness. The box stood on stage, not as a prop but as a grave marker. Once, after a show, a young boy asked him, "Mr. Brown, were you scared in that box?" Henry smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but I was more scared of never being free." In that single line lay all his pain, all his strength, all his truth. He performed for decades, a ghost carrying his own legend. He taught his daughter music, told her stories of the sea and the South, of courage and loss, but he never found Nancy again. He never knew what became of his children. Freedom had cost him everything he loved. By the time the century neared its end, Henry Brown was an old man. He lived quietly in Canada, still performing on small stages, still stepping in and out of the box that had once carried him to life. In his final known appearance, in 1889, witnesses said he stood before a small crowd and placed his hand on the box. His voice shook as he said, "This saved my body, but it also took my soul." He closed the lid gently, as if saying goodbye. In the next part, we uncover the final years of Henry Box Brown, his legacy, his mysterious disappearance, and how one man's impossible journey became a forgotten legend buried beneath time. In the winter of 1889, somewhere near Toronto, an aging man carried a weathered wooden box onto a small stage. His hair was gray now, his hands thin. The audience, a handful of townspeople and travelers, waited quietly. Few knew his name, fewer still knew his story. He introduced himself simply as Henry Box Brown. For nearly 40 years, he had performed under that name. Some had thought him long dead. Others believed he had vanished into myth. Yet there he was, frail, calm, and still tethered to the box that had once carried him across the edge of life and death. He looked at the audience and said, "This box once saved me. I owe it everything, and I fear it too." Those were among his last recorded words. After that night, Henry's trail fades into silence. Records stop. No official death certificate. No burial record. Some say he died in Canada, others that he returned south. There are whispers that he disappeared during one of his tours, leaving the box behind empty. The truth remains uncertain, but what history does remember is how he lived and how he refused to die in chains. Henry's legacy did not fade immediately. In abolitionist circles, his name was once spoken alongside Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. He was a symbol of ingenuity, a man who defied a system designed to crush every trace of human will. Yet as Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow rose from its ashes, men like Henry were written out of public memory. In textbooks, his name appeared only in fragments, a paragraph, a footnote, a curious anecdote about a man who mailed himself to freedom. The depth of his suffering, his faith, his courage, and his loss, all reduced to a single unbelievable act. But Henry's story was more than an escape. It was a mirror held up to America's conscience. He had turned the machinery of commerce, the shipping industry, into a weapon against slavery itself. He had used the mail system, the heartbeat of trade, to deliver not goods, but freedom. In a nation where human beings were bought and sold, Henry made himself both package and protest. To the slave owners who pursued him, his escape was humiliation. To the abolitionists who celebrated him, it was revelation. But to Henry, it was survival. After the Civil War, when slavery ended, he could have stayed in England, safe and comfortable. Instead, he returned to a nation still scarred by hatred. Perhaps he hoped to find peace. Perhaps he hoped to find Nancy. But by then she was gone. Sold, remarried, lost to history. That wound never healed. There are few surviving letters from his later life, but one fragment remains undated, unsigned, found among abolitionist archives in Boston. The handwriting matches his. It reads, "I am a free man, but my heart still remembers the box. Every breath I take feels borrowed. Every sunrise feels stolen. Freedom came to me, but it came at the cost of everything I loved." It's unclear to whom he wrote it, maybe to himself. In 1900, long after his disappearance, an article appeared in a small Canadian newspaper titled "The Man Who Escaped by Mail." It described a traveling showman, an elderly Negro gentleman who once journeyed from Virginia to Philadelphia in a box. The author wrote that the man spoke little of it, only smiled when asked, and said the Lord was his true deliverer. That was the last sighting of Henry Box Brown. He had outlived slavery, outlived most of his generation, and outlived the very cause that made him famous. History moved on, and the man who had once defied it quietly stepped aside. Yet, his box remained passed from hand to hand, eventually ending up in a private collection. No one knows if it was the real one, but standing before it, one cannot help but imagine what it carried, not just a man, but an idea. The idea that freedom could be seized even from inside a coffin. In that way, Henry never vanished. He became part of something larger, a legend that haunts the American story, reminding it of its sins and its possibilities. The man who once fit inside a wooden crate had expanded beyond it. His name, his silence, his defiance, they endure like the echo of nails being pulled from wood in the dead of night. Next, the final part, how Henry's legend was rediscovered, and how modern America struggles to remember the man who mailed himself to freedom. It begins in silence, a museum basement in Richmond, Virginia, where a curator brushes dust from a wooden crate marked with faint letters, "Dry goods, handle with care." The year is 1997. She doesn't know it yet, but she's holding the ghost of a man who once turned a coffin into a doorway. The box is old, scarred, and smaller than you'd expect. 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, less than 2.5 feet deep. The kind of box you wouldn't think could hold a human being. And yet, once, it did. This box carried a man named Henry Brown. The story of the slave who mailed himself to freedom had become a myth by the late 20th century. Many doubted it ever happened. Some thought it was propaganda, others dismissed it as impossible. But the discovery of that box and the records that followed forced history to confront its own blindness. Inside the archives of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, curators found a shipping manifest dated March 29, 1849. The sender, W.H. Jones, Richmond. The receiver, James M. McKim, Philadelphia. The cargo, dry goods, weight, 90 kilograms. The handwriting was unmistakable. The evidence was real. Henry Box Brown was no legend. He had lived, breathed, and outwitted the entire machinery of human bondage. Yet, the rediscovery of his story raised another question. Why did America forget him? Historians argue it's because his method was too symbolic, too unsettling. Slavery was supposed to be a wound healed by time. Henry's escape reminded the nation that freedom wasn't given. It was stolen, piece by piece, box by box. His story did not comfort the accused in his act. Henry turned the idea of the slave into the image of resurrection. He was buried and then reborn. He emerged from a coffin not as property, but as a man. It was both miracle and indictment. The museum placed the box on display behind glass, under a soft, sterile light. Visitors passed by, whispered, moved on. Some stared longer, wondering how anyone could have survived in it. Others couldn't look at all. What they didn't see was what the box represented, not just the endurance of one man, but the cost of freedom itself. Henry's story resurfaced in classrooms, in documentaries, in quiet corners of the internet. The box became a metaphor again, but also a mirror. It asked a question that still lingers. How many people must bury themselves to be reborn into freedom for a nation built on liberty? That question cuts deep. The box now sits in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, preserved behind reinforced glass. It's surrounded by exhibits of rebellion, courage, and pain. Children press their hands to the glass. Parents lower their voices when they read the plaque. It says only this: Henry Box Brown, 1815 to 1897, born enslaved, mailed himself to freedom, lived to tell the story. There's no grave, no headstone, no date of death, only that box. And maybe that's fitting, because Henry's life was never about where he ended, but how far he dared to go. Sometimes, history hides its heroes in silence. It buries them beneath the noise of wars and politics, waiting for someone to open the lid again. Henry Brown's story is one of those buried truths, the kind that refuses to stay in the dark. He was a man who turned a coffin into a vessel of hope, who crossed from death to life in the most literal sense, who proved that freedom is not a gift, but a decision. When you stand before that box, if you listen closely, the silence hums, the wood creaks, the air feels heavy, almost alive. It's as if something inside still breathes, a faint reminder that once, a man chose to stop being property and start being human. And in that moment, every heartbeat echoes his, because freedom, once found, never truly dies.